it going, everybody? Chariots of the Gods, man. That's right. Today I'm here to talk about John Carpenter's The Thing from 1982. A famously was dismissed at the time as by critics, really despised by critics at the time, and was also a box office failure in the summer of 1982 when it was released. I'll have a little bit more to say about it. But really, in the 40 years or so since this film has been out, or it's really taken on a life of its own, and maybe considered the greatest horror science fiction film of all time, or is certainly in the conversation for top 5, top 10, or if anyone's ranking things. I'm not one to rank things, but I would say The Thing would have to be in the conversation. So there's there's a lot to say about this film. I don't want to go on too long, so I just wanted to say a few things about my impressions of The Thing. So obviously it's a remake of The Thing from Another World from the early 1950s, which I reviewed on my channel a few months ago, which that review is still up. So this is I would say a very radical reinterpretation of the story. A lot of it goes back to the original short, Who Goes There, by Campbell, and Carpenter and Bill Lancaster, who wrote the screenplay for this version, took some things from that story, mainly the paranoia thread from it. The 51 film is very much informed by Cold War paranoia, and The Thing is. The 1982 version is also very much, it hits the paranoia theme so much harder in 1982. There's a little bit aspect of the Cold War aspect to it, but this film really goes much further with the paranoia, which what makes it so fascinating. So there's many interpretations of this film. I think and many fan theories, which I have not even begun to get into all of the fan. I've never did a deep dive into the fan theories of The Thing. I'm probably familiar with some, but it's a movie that's so open to interpretation, and I think watching the film, every time you watch it, I think you get the sense of it's such there's something opaque about the narrative of the film, where there's so many red herrings, there's so many clues about what's possibly going on. It's a very disorienting film to watch, in the fact that as the paranoia happening with the characters goes right to the audience that's watching it, where we don't know who's the thing, who's not the thing, and that's such a, it's really a case of, I think, what's happening on the screen really infecting the audience almost with what's happening, to kind of go with that idea. And just a real brief on the film itself. So we're at a scientific station in Antarctica, if I can pronounce that. And it's the film starts out where we're at the base, and a helicopter. The camera's following a helicopter that's chasing a dog, trying to kill a dog. We learn that these are Norwegians. There's a Norwegian station nearby, and they're trying to kill the dog, which, the Americans are like, why are they trying to kill the dog? And, well, of course we know, because the dog is carrying the infection of the thing, the contagion aspect of it, which comes to infect the entire station. And that's the setup for the movie. And I mean, the cast of the movie is, we have a large cast. It's an all-male cast, led by Kurt Russell as McReady, who is the helicopter pilot at the base. And he's interesting. I have a little bit more to say about that character in a bit, but I could go through the whole cast. We have Wilford Brimley in here as Blair, who's a biologist, memorable, who he figures out really what's going on with the thing and what's happening. We got T.K. Carter as Knowles, the cook, David Clennon, Richard Dysart as the doctor, Charles Hallahan as Norris, Keith David, early Keith David role, and so on and so on. There's not to list everybody in the cast, but those are the principals. Also, Richard Mazer in here as Clark, the dog handler. Understood Richard Mazer was supposed to be an E.T., or he was offered a role in E.T., but decided to do the thing, which is interesting. I assume the role he was offered for E.T. was the Peter Coyote role, but I could be wrong with that. Donald Moffat in here, famous. Think of him playing presidents and generals. Here he plays the I guess the military side of the base, in charge of it. So we have a really great cast here, and the fact that it's all male. There's been a lot of commentary on that in the film, and a little bit more to say about that. It changes the dynamic of the story. Whereas like in Alien a few years before, we have a more gender, there's males and females on the crew of the Nostromo, but here it's all male, and that really affects the trajectory of the story. Like they're talking about how they're isolated at this base, they have to spend a lot of time together, and we get the sense even at the start of the film that everyone is really edgy with each other, tired of each other's company. Everyone's just trying to maybe stay in their own space a little bit. Although some of them are friends, we kind of get the sense that David Clennon's character and T.K. Carter's character seem to be friends, and so there are some. I don't know if I call friendships among this staff, but there is some camaraderie. But of course, that's all going to come apart as the story unfolds. And one thing that's pointed out, I listened to the Projection Booths podcast, great podcast, who did like a 4-hour episode on the thing, and one person on the panel pointed out when we first meet McReady at the start of the film, he's playing computer chess and he's losing the game, and it is notable that the voice is female. Adrienne Barbeau, I believe, is the voice. And what does he do? He's losing, and he destroys the computer. So, he pours a drink in the computer and destroys it because he's losing. And that tells us a lot about McReady's character, I think. Like, kind of bring a little bit of the Cold War into this and the idea of mutually assured destruction. And I really felt like my take on the character is that he seems to personify that, where as the story unfolds, and I think McReady realizes there's really no way they can defeat it and survive, realizes that's impossible, and settles on, it's going to have to be a mutually assured destruction type of situation, and I feel like that plays out through the film, and there's absolutely no sentiment in the film, I think, as the situation gets more and more dire for all the characters in the film. And of course, the thing, we open the film with the spaceship, and we realize this being has been buried in the ice for thousands of years, and it can shapeshift, and it can take over humans, imitate humans. So it's like this shape-shifting form that's very amenable to, and you don't know who's the thing, you don't know who's infected, and it is like a really tricky concept. I think the movie pulls off, whereas in Alien it's a little bit more straightforward. I mean, the xenomorph will use you as a parasite, basically, is the way it attacks humans, but it's way, way more subtle in the thing as far as how this creature is able to work and survive by imitating other species and doing things like that. Of course, it starts with the dogs first, and then it moves into infecting the humans on the base, and the idea where multiple humans can also be infected by the thing, I think, is another really complex way that this thing works, and I think back to the all male cast thing where, machismo, the traditional macho hero does, it doesn't really work against the thing, because this thing can shapeshift and it can play mind games and it can do so many things. This is not something you can necessarily, fight through courage or physical brawn or anything like that. Its attack is almost more psychological than physical. And I think the way the male characters react to it is interesting, and I think there's probably been way more interesting things written about that. But I do think that's one of the items that makes, or themes that makes, the movie really work in that regard, is the complexity of the creature. Yeah, and I mean, there's many memorable scenes in this film. Most famously, there's the blood test scene, and there's the transformation scenes. Most notably, the Rob Bottin effects are just incredible in this, and I think still hit hard today. When the character Gnomes is apparently having a heart attack, and then the doctor tries to resuscitate him, and the chest turns into like a big mandible jaw and chews his hands off. It's really horrifying stuff, and I really think there's just so many memorable moments, and the dialogue is really memorable as well, which I quoted my favorite line, "Chariots of the Gods, man," but Russell has a lot of great lines in the film. Trust is a tough thing to come by is a great one that he uses, and the whole scene where McReady is recording, into the tape recorders, talking about, no one trusts each other and we're all very tired, and which really sums it up, and is interesting choice the character makes there. This is his confession on tape. So yeah, a lot of memorable dialogue in the film, a lot of humor in the movie too. As grim as the movie is, I think there's some really comical moments in the movie too, to make light of it, and also really works. Yeah, and the Dean Cundey cinematography is just, I think, stunningly great, with that light blue sheen with the snow and the blue, and it's incredible. Of course, part of it was filmed on location in British Columbia, pretty close to way up north, very cold. And I know in the past I've listened to the commentary track with Carpenter and Russell, and they have great stories about what it was like to film way up there. I know some of it was done in the studio under heavy air conditioning and all that at Universal Studios, so it was, yeah. So, but the cinematography is fantastic in the film, and the way it works, and the lighting and everything is visually, it's just a really great film, in addition to the dialogue and the special effects and the soundscape in the film, the sounds of these transformations happening, and things like that. And so it's interesting, back to the projection booth, they were talking about the thing creature being arguably the female character in the film, and as far as like the way, mentioned that scene with the chess earlier in the film, and like them being, the thing is able to outsmart them, and kind of use their own, problem solving skills against them. It seems to always be 3 or 4 steps ahead, and that's interesting too. And I think some of the transformation scenes, I think there's a lot of symbolism there. We could talk about with gender, I won't spell it out, but I think if you watch those scenes, there's a lot there to think about in the film, and Yeah, yeah. Of course, there's the Lovecraft of it all, H.P. Lovecraft, and I think the cosmic horror of the film. I really think that aspect of it comes out through the Wilford Brimley character when he is, at the computer, and he is, doing his calculations about if this thing spreads into the population and that it will, infect everybody within whatever months or something, and he kind of goes crazy, like he literally loses his mind, once he makes that discovery, and that's very Lovecraft, like to discover something so awful and so terrible it literally makes you go mad. So I thought that was that in there as well, which is really really good. Really amps up the horror. I mean, there's yeah, yeah. So the thing is just a movie. I think you could talk about all day, all night. It's such a rewatchable movie. I think what I was talking about later, how there is something opaque or elliptical about the narrative of the film, and how there is that Agatha Christie quality of it, and then there were none. How characters keep disappearing, and that as well. But like I said, we're always off our toes. There's something about the way the movie is edited and the structure of it. We're always the suspense is just so palpable throughout the film, and as the story continues to escalate, and yeah. And so anyway, and just a bit on the film's box office. So 1982, the film famously didn't do well, and Carpenter apparently, and I know there's an anecdote in this book, I think I mentioned in previous videos, The Future Was Now, which is about the sci-fi films of 1982, where Carpenter was looking at some marketing data and tried to convince Universal to not release the film in the summer. And yeah, I'll just read it from the book here. It says, it was the Carpenter began reading a recent study about audience demographics that the studio had distributed. The study concluded the market for horror movies, a market which he had largely created a few years earlier with Halloween, had shrunk by 70% over the previous 6 months. Carpenter was beginning to think that he had just made a movie for an audience that no longer existed. He got up and walked over to the office of Universal's head of marketing and said that the way things are going, the studio should scrap the thing's summer release and keep it on the shelf until Halloween, when moviegoers were primed and in the mood to be scared and grossed out. So I think Carpenter was right. I mean, I think, like, famously, I would not bring up E.T. around Carpenter. He'd probably get very annoyed and angry if that film was brought up. But yeah, I think if they waited a few months, I think if they had held off to October, who knows? Maybe that could have. Timing is everything, they say, and I think this would have been much better as a late October release, especially since it's a wintry film and we're going into the winter season. I just think that might have been, who knows, it might have hit. It might have hit different, but we'll never know. We'll never know, of course. And I mean, a lot's been said about this film really doing some damage to Carpenter's career because it didn't do well, and the studio had so much confidence in it. But and that's one of the great what ifs too. I mean, of course, Carpenter would continue making really good films for the 1980s. I mean, Starman, Big Trouble in Little China, Christine are all fantastic films. Prince of Darkness, They Live. I mean, he is still on a great run, but I don't know if that narrative sometimes when they say, like, what if the thing had been a big hit? You do wonder what would have been Carpenter's. I mean, would he be getting bigger budgets, bigger projects? I guess would have been a possibility there, but like I said, we'll never know. And but anyway, it's a great part of the story of the thing and how it's caught on with fans so much. Part of me thinks, or Spielberg was always someone who was, especially in the 70s, 80s, 90s, who was so in touch with what audiences wanted. He really had had his fingers on the pulse of what audiences wanted, and Carpenter always seemed to be a few steps ahead. Of course, Halloween hit big, of course, in '78, and then there was The Fog and Escape from New York, which both did well. But a lot of his films really stand up well, and who knows if the thing had come out maybe a few years later, it would have hit differently. And but I think you could say that about a lot of his films. It took a while for them to. I think Big Trouble Little China and They Live are also in that category too, where it took audiences a while to realize how really really good those films were. So anyway, yeah, and like I said, you can keep talking about the thing. I think there's just so much to unravel and unwrap in this film, because its history is so fascinating, and as we look at the thing. But yeah, I'd be curious about your thoughts on the thing, and if anyone has any comments, or if you have any theories about the movie, or anything, thoughts overall, comparing it to the 1951 film as well, if anyone has any thoughts there. But yeah, I think I've covered what I've wanted to say. And anyway, thanks for watching, and I guess we'll just have to wait around and see what happens. We'll talk to you later.